And we're live.
Hi everyone, welcome to another DML Commons Salon. It's May 13th and we're here for the Unit 3 of the four-part DBR design-based research strand led by the DML Hub. Today we're going to have a conversation about how people actually use conjecture maps or other forms of recording and testing conjectures in their work. I am Danielle DiGiacomo and I'm here from the University of Colorado Boulder and co-facilitating this with Katie Van Horn from CU Boulder and with Sinam Sian from CSU San Marcos. I am excited to welcome our invited panelists who bring a range of backgrounds and expertise to design-based research. And I'll let everyone introduce themselves now.
Hi everybody, I'm Bill Sandoval. I'm a professor in the Urban Schooling Division at UCLA, and I have the dubious distinction of being responsible for this idea.
Thanks, Bill.
And I'm Bill Penuel, and I'm a professor in learning sciences at CU Boulder, and I am also a member of the Connected Learning Research Network.
And so thanks to the participants. One more thing before we get started is that as a reminder to everyone who's listening, please write down your name on the roll call. It's on the Etherpad. We will be sure to take notes and also relay the questions to the panelists. If you're watching this Hangout from DML Commons webpage, we also really encourage you to jump onto the Etherpad or via the Twitter hashtag DML Comments. So I'll start out first with a question for Bill Sandoval, which is such that in your 2014 article, you talk about conjecture mapping as primarily an organizing method for design-based research. Can you talk a little bit about how you came to understand the utility of conjecture mapping as a methodological support?
Yeah, I'll tell a little story about the history of that idea, and the history is actually fairly long, but I'll try to keep the story short. So when I was a sort of a young scholar and assistant professor back in, I think it was 1999, Chris Hoadley and I were at a conference, and we ran into each other and started complaining about how people were using this phrase design experiments as sort of an excuse for not actually designing their research, right? So people seem to be sort of doing things where they would just say, hey, we made something and we just threw it out there in a classroom and we saw what happened, and that's because we're doing a design experiment. And we thought that this was bad because it didn't actually feel like research so much as fooling around. And so we went to the Spencer Foundation, and they gave us some money to collect a bunch of other people, sort of junior career people like ourselves, and to try to figure out what in the world did it mean to do a design experiment. And so that work sort of unfolded through a few kind of seminars that we had over a couple of years, and it was during that time that I originally said to that group that I thought of designing itself, so that the act of putting together some piece of software or some learning environment or any intervention was really a way of embodying some conjectures you had about how learning happened in the design. And so so, you know, I said that and I forgot about it, and then a couple of years later I started thinking about, so what did that really mean? And the first version of this idea came out in 2004, actually, in an issue of Educational Psychologist that Phil Bell and I co-edited. And a few people read that, just a tiny few people read that, and they started asking me what I meant about it. And that led to actually a visit with Pierre Dillenborg at EPFL in Switzerland in about 2007, and it was actually Pierre that sort of got me to think about the difference between the kinds of conjectures that might be operating in this kind of a thing, and he was actually the one who kind of gave me the language of design conjectures versus theoretical conjectures. And so after not thinking about it very seriously for a long time, I finally decided to sort of try to write down what I thought it really meant to do to kind of map a conjecture. What does it really mean to do that? And for me, the reason to do it was twofold. One is because design research, I had sort of been under some mild attack as an actual way of doing research, because people are in some cases justifiably concerned that we're not serious enough ahead of time about what it is that we're trying to do. And also just for my own work, I thought that I would make fewer mistakes in the research, right? I still make plenty of mistakes in the design, but I would make fewer mistakes in the research if I thought more carefully ahead of time what exactly I expected to happen if an intervention was enacted in a particular kinds of way. What kinds of things would I look for, and how would I relate those things to outcomes?
Can I ask a follow-up, Bill? In terms of what your conversation with Pierre was, and making this distinction between theoretical and design conjectures. Could you elaborate on the distinction, and why is that distinction important to you in this work?
That's a really good question, actually. So for me, I just was sort of using this word conjecture, and you might ask, like, why call them conjectures as opposed to hypotheses or whatever? And part of the reason for that is that, to my mind, a conjecture is a much sort of looser thing, right? It's not exactly a guess, but it's not as sort of strict as a hypothesis, at least to my mind. So, and that's important to me because I think we have to take it as a given that when we're trying to do really novel designs, that we really don't have a super clear idea about what we're doing, right? So the conversations that I had with Pierre and his group were around, so what did you learn? So for example, if you just think about the structure of a map, right? So you have this notion that conjectures get embodied in design features that you expect are going to lead to certain mediating processes, so sort of things that you will see happening during the enactment of something. And then if you think about the world in terms of those kinds of things leading to outcomes, then you specify a set of outcomes that you expect to see, right? And so Pierre and I sort of began trying to figure out, well, what did it mean if you did or didn't see a mediating process versus what would it mean if you did or didn't achieve an outcome? And so as I began to think about that, I began to persuade myself that if you didn't see the mediating processes you expected, then that probably told you that there was something wrong with your design, not necessarily the underlying theory about learning or instruction that motivates that design. Whereas if you see the mediating processes that you expect, but you don't see the outcomes you expect, then your underlying theory is definitely wrong, right? So that's sort of where, for me, that distinction operates.
Thanks, Bill. That's very helpful, and that attended to actually a question audience that came up in terms of, is there a distinction between hypothesis and conjecture? So that was, you already somehow saw that. And so that sort of leads into our next question. As we were talking about this as a group beforehand, we were thinking about that idea of theoretical frameworks in terms of what theoretical frameworks do you use to inform your work, and how do you, if at all, shift your conjectures as your framework shift or as you've developed as a scholar?
So are you asking about what my particular theoretical frameworks are?
Yeah, I think we were curious because as a group we were talking about how, for example, junior scholars in learning sciences often use activity theory, and how would conjecture mapping, can it map onto activity theory as well as others, or how can we make sure that we are attending to all of the contradictions that activity theory espouses with the support of conjecture mapping as a methodological tool?
Okay, so I see myself as a situated theorist, right? So my perspective is definitely that cognition is situated, and to the extent that I understand activity theory, right, which is probably debatable, but to the extent that I understand it, I find it consonant with the way that I think about the world, and I actually think it's a very valuable framework for thinking about intervening in schools, for example, right? I don't believe, I mean, I might be naive about this, but I don't believe that conjecture mapping is aligned with any particular theoretical framework. I mean, it might be. I would be sort of open to being persuaded about that, but I don't really see it that way, because I don't see conjecture mapping as actually a methodology of doing research. I think of it as an approach to organizing research, right? And so it's not really like a research method. It's more like it's almost like a workflow tool, I think. So so I think to the extent that you were coming from any particular theoretical perspective, that would certainly drive the kinds of conjectures that you make about learning. And then that would drive how you think those get reified in a learning environment. But I actually think, so for me, one of the things that changed historically over time from but I don't think it was a change in my theoretical framework so much as an insight from empirical work, was the need to attend to discourse very specifically as an element of design, and the idea that you can actually design for particular kinds of discourse and what that might look like. And so, so for example, if you were to compare the conjecture map in my 2004 piece with the conjecture map that came out a decade later, you'll see that there's sort of a box in there for thinking about discourse that wasn't there before. So I don't really know if that's answered the question exactly as you guys have put it.
No, it does. I mean, selfishly, it really helps me think about it, because in working with conjecture maps and trying to distinguish between the task structures, participant structures, and discursive practices, I found that it's very important to think about how those are distinct from each other, and if not, so that that answer made a lot of sense for me. Thanks.
Bill, I wanted to try something on and see what you think about it. So I think I agree with you that it's not, conjecture map isn't tied to a particular theoretical framework, but it's really useful for what the Dutch would call local instructional theory, what Cobb and de Sessa would call humble theory. Like it's kind of that level that really helps you do design work that is in some ways, if you're like I try to work within a larger frame of chat, but then when I go to do design work, I need that local theory, and I sort of think of the conjecture map as my way of being disciplined about what is my local theory, what's my humble theory, if you will. And I wonder if you think about it similarly, or how you might respond to that.
So I actually definitely see it exactly the same way. I mean, I don't really believe that very many of us change the overarching theoretical frameworks that we work in. I mean, I think actually you can look through the history of science and see that kind of change is incredibly rare, right? And actually, like, I don't really think my research as even trying to test these overarching theoretical perspectives in any very direct way, right? Because I'm not sure they're open to that kind of work. So for me, the idea behind conjecture maps is exactly what you just said. It's really about trying to be disciplined about how do I expect this particular thing that I'm trying to do to actually function, and how would I figure out if it's functioning the way that I expect, and that's why it's producing the things that it's producing, that sort of outcomes it's producing.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. So I'm taking notes alongside, that's why I'm switching back a little bit. So we're going to do this one here. So can you think of instances in your work when you've started off by creating a conjecture map, but ultimately decided it wasn't the right tool for the particular project you were on or research that you were doing?
Yes, and actually, so I'm not. For me personally, I'm not sure. This might sound really weird and even heretical, but I'm not sure that finishing a conjecture map is necessarily the most valuable reason for starting one, right? So there have been I have found in a couple of projects that when I'm very early on in the process of trying to think about what the work is about, it's really difficult to actually do a conjecture map, right? So I have a couple of times now sort of abandoned the effort to try to specify a conjecture map because I didn't have a good enough handle on actually what it was I was trying to design, right? But the effort to try to commit some of those ideas specifically has been a way to prompt more work on that design, right? So I guess I think so. What might you take from that? What you might take, and Bill Sandoval, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. It may be that if you don't understand enough about what you're trying to design, maybe it's just not even workable to try to make a conjecture map, right? Because you kind of have to at least have some idea about what the design is about first, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things that I'm I'm trying to think about the ways that I've been using them in the last year, and I would say it's not at the first moment of the project, but actually once the project is starting to take shape, I have a sense of, the one I'll talk about later involves a research practice partnership, so I'm starting to even have a sense of the activity structures that define the work, and that are going to have to define the work, meaning I don't actually get to control all this stuff. But if I think of them as, well, these are at least partly designed settings, what are the features that are really doing the work of design and doing the work of fostering these mediating processes? So I'd say it's definitely not at the very beginning. I'm with you. But it raised a question for me, is something you also said earlier about thinking about conjecture and hypothesis, Bill. What's the mix of elements on that map that are pretty well grounded in somebody's previous work in, say, learning sciences versus, do you want the whole map to be speculative, or do you want a certain region of your map to be more conjectural and out there and pushing the boundary? Because for me, I sort of think it can't all be conjecture. Some of it, part of this conjecture map too, is a discipline of building on what other people have done in our field and try to put that and embody that in certain ways in the designs. So I'm wondering what you think about that mixture.
I mean, that's actually a really great point, and I'll be honest with you, I haven't really thought about that very much before, but I think it's an excellent point, and it actually suggests to me that it would be interesting to think about how to sort of add to the kind of visual language of conjecture maps to try to indicate like what things you're kind of certain about based on prior work and what things really are the conjectures that are in play, right? Because you can't try to sort of track through all the conjectures at once. It's impossible, right? And so for me, part of the value of making the maps is just so that you can see what the choices are, so that you can, as you said earlier, make some disciplined choices, right? But I absolutely agree with you that there ought to be a way in the mapping process itself to try to sort of indicate, like, look, these are the things that we're pretty sure of, and that would actually lead you to different kinds of conclusions, right? So if you were pretty sure that if X happened, then Y would happen, and Y didn't happen, then you could also be pretty confident that you just designed X badly, right? And you should sort of fix that. So yeah, and it just, to me, that relates to a point that I tried to make in that article, and I really sort of hope for, and that is that for me the sort of act of writing that paper about conjecture maps was just so that there would be something to argue about, right? Something to critique, something to knock down, because as a field we've done very little work to put out these kinds of models before, right? So there's lots of room, there's lots of ways that conjecture maps or other tools could do better what I'm trying to do with them.
Well, I found the process of writing the justification, the text around the map, is where I get clear about what's speculative versus what I think I'm building on. And so it's the map plus the text for me that helps me get clearer in my thinking about, well, what do I think are the mediating processes here? What are the key ingredients in the design, and how do they relate to a set of high-level conjectures too? So I've definitely found it useful, not so much as a sense of, well, I think this is how we think about it, designs and learning sciences. It's not just to put out for critique, but to try on and then push and develop. And so I sort of feel like through the past year, had in a sense, like just like I said, well, one insight is it's really helpful to think about what's established versus what's new. And so I found it an extremely useful tool in that respect.
Well, that's good to hear from my perspective. One thing that people ask me all the time is well, so how do the conjecture maps themselves change over time, right? And I still don't have a good answer for that. I actually think that's one of the real limitations to that kind of visualization, right? And for me, I think so maybe I just have to hold myself to sort of trying to do this in our own work. But for me, I think one of the things that I would like to see happen would be for somebody to come up with some good ideas about how to represent that kind of change.
Yeah, we're actually trying to do a little bit of that on a project called the Research Practice Collaboratory, which Phil Bell's involved in, Exploratory and EDC and CU. And one of the, we have a set of very high-level conjectures that organize that project, which are about, they're at a different level than, Bill, you've written about in the 2 articles. They're about how research and practice might be redesigned, that relationship. And each of us has conjecture maps that relate to our particular strands of work, and what we're doing is seeing if we can, every 6 months or so, have a discussion as a center as to how we would tweak and revise them. And I'll say we've struggled with that. Like we sit down to do it and we rewrite, but one of the challenges is the record keeping around the versions and what the justification for the changes. I think we keep the versions, but then one of the things that's hard to do is keep the record. And it reminds me of the fate of John Carroll, and user-centered design has been a big advocate of design rationales. And a lot of teams, and I'm an advocate of design rationales, but you almost need somebody whose sole job it is to do that, because it sounds like a great idea to keep a record of what your design decisions are and why you made them. But nearly every team that's tried them has abandoned the project because it becomes cumbersome as its own. It becomes too cumbersome as a task in the midst of design. But I think we all recognize, boy, that happens all the time in design research too, is we get too caught up in our design. And that's the point you're trying to make with his articles, is we need to stop and really think about what we're doing as a form of research too. So more dilemma is not a solution, but we're definitely trying this out.
Yeah, but it makes me, that whole set of issues makes me think about how the map, in the process of making and revising maps, or again some analogous tool, like I don't care if it's maps or whatever, but if there's sort of some kind of a social infrastructure to develop around revisiting maps and kind of pegging the parts of the map, like, okay, this arrow we know is there, right? We're not so sure about this one. Because again, for me, it's about it's some, like, whether the map itself represents its own kind of conceptual outcome, I think is like far from clear. I don't really know. I don't have too many thoughts about that yet. But for me, the reason to do it is to organize a program of research, right? So to be able to say, and I do think there's kind of an implied logic that you probably should be testing your design conjectures before you worry about the theoretical ones, although I think in practice those things probably play against each other more than we might like to think, right? But definitely there's a, the conjecture map, as I've articulated right now, is essentially a kind of an artifact, and what I haven't thought about very much yet is what's the kind of process of using and revising that artifact, and how could you document that in a way that people could use. And I don't know. Those of you on this call, just help us out, figure it out.
We have a question from someone on the call.
for observing the call. Says, in an article, you give an example of a conjecture map that grows due to an observation in practice. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, but also, have you ever reduced a conjecture map based on a classroom experience?
So I think in that article, I think so. I think if I'm remembering this right, then I think that what that's referring to is my realization that discourse practices really matter as a function of design, right? So that's the way in which that map grew. So if we think about that, that's a particular kind of growth, right? That's like realizing that there's an entire aspect of design that you hadn't thought about before that you need to think about. So I doubt those kinds of things are likely to get pruned, although I don't know, maybe they would. So, but the other thing is that, like, people should not have the impression that, like, I figured out how to draw a picture of conjecture maps in 2004, and then I started using them all the time since then, right? I actually don't myself have a ton of experience trying to use these things, right? So, you know, it took until really this most recent piece in JLS for me to actually convince myself that, one, it was a thing that you could do, right? Because when you try to do them, it seems impossible to do it. So I had to persuade myself, one, that I could actually do it, and then two, that it had some value to doing it. But there are still, there's still a lot of, so where am I going with that? What I'm trying to say is, no, I haven't yet had a map shrink, right? But we can hold out hope.
Great, thank you.
I want to follow up on something that I think came twice about, when you mentioned the discursive practices. In your article, you identify interaction analysis and artifact analysis as two sort of methods that DBR uses. Is that an analysis, or is it something that you prefer that you see in DBR projects?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute for a second. You've caught me. So, for me, I mean, I think what I'm really trying to say in that article, I guess I'm trying to present a sort of agnosticism about research method, because I don't think there's necessarily a lot of value to be overly prescriptive about the kinds of methods that can do particular kinds of things. But I do think that, so for me, I prefer in my own work to do interaction analysis, because for the kinds of things I'm interested in, that gets me the kind of detail I want to be able to draw the inferences about things like discourse that I want, right? So I don't know how, if you were pursuing a design, right, or an intervention that you felt relied on particular forms of discourse, then there are only so many ways available to you to capture that discourse and understand if it's happening in the way that you intend it to be happening, or the way that you sort of designed it, right? So, and I happen to think that in the learning sciences we have this technique of interaction analysis that we've kind of inherited and appropriated from ethnography, that's really, really useful. But I don't think that it's necessarily the case that you have to analyze interaction in order to document mediating processes, right? So that's kind of what that was supposed to be about.
So I think there's one thing you're not agnostic about, but it's a reference that a lot of people might not know, and I think interaction analysis begins with the premise that the cause of an action, or the reason, I can observe it as preceding what happened before, and that it's substantive, it's something that people can experience. This is a very different notion of causality than we have in randomized control trials, when we're trying to infer whether intervention X caused something else. And you cite Maxwell's paper in there, I believe. I can't remember if it's the older article or the newer one. And to me, that's actually a really important theoretical commitment, to say, I can observe this stuff. Like, I don't have to turn the classroom into a black box to make claims about how these mediating processes lead to these learning outcomes. So am I painting you too much into a corner there, Bill, or do you agree with that?
No, I do agree with that. See, you know, it's actually what's interesting to me is the kinds of things that you can insert into an article to try not to run your flag so obviously up the pole, right, as to make people mad. But no, I think that's true. Like, I do think, I mean, to me, design, like, it's hard for me to understand design research as not fitting into an epistemology of sort of causal processes as being observable, right? I do think that that's at least an implicit epistemological commitment behind design research, and I also think that, you know, empirically you could make a case that you have to have some way at accounting for contextual variations, right? I mean, you know, Lee Cronbach was arguing about the sort of time-limited nature of aptitude treatment interactions 40 years ago in a way that a Vygotsky would love, actually, and we have so many examples of interventions that treat classrooms like a black box, that seem like they work, and then when they spread, suddenly the effects sort of dissipate. Well, how can you explain that? The only way you can explain that is through accounting for contextual variation, in my opinion, right? So I'm perfectly happy to agree with that, to cop to that.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, why interactional analysis. That's a strong motivation for it, because that's your empirical warrant for making a claim about, well, this observable process led to this outcome or was connected somehow. And so we need detailed analyses, whether it's interaction analysis, critical discourse analysis, ethnography. Something is providing us with that warrant to be able to say this mediating process happened, and here's how I justify that, and then I can see a learning outcome that I really, or developmental outcome that I care about that followed that.
Yeah, well, so I think one thing that I think I still wonder is whether or not something as detailed as interaction analysis, as that particular method, is the only way you can analyze interaction between various kinds of factors that you might think matter, right?
Yeah.
So interaction analysis is about analyzing interactions between people. But there might be a way to characterize interactions between elements of a design and the things that those designs lead to that don't require that fine-grained analysis.
Right. And also the phenomenon might be longer term and across setting, and so the grain size is too small. I'm thinking of like Rich Lair and Leona Chauvel's work. I think when you see a report of their, especially recent work on seeding the foundations of evolutionary thought, it's not at that microanalysis level, but really trying to trace a classroom over a period of a year or even more as they undergo transformations in the ways that that kids are thinking about phenomena, and also thinking about it at the classroom as a unit of learning as opposed to just individual students. So that's another thing is, your phenomenon and what you're trying to do, what's its time horizon, what's its spatial horizon, that matters for the kind of analysis you need to do.
So those two things, also time and sort of space, are not especially well captured in the kind of current way that I think about conjecture maps, and it would be interesting to think about, again, what sort of visual grammar that you might be able to develop to be able to capture those kinds of things, right? I mean, I'd almost like to see Rich and Leona, Lair and Chauvel, I'd almost like to see them make a post hoc conjecture map that they think would account for their work, just so we could have an example of what that sort of thing might look like.
I sort of wonder too, Bill, in terms of the boxes themselves, I wonder if there's a role for design theory. Danny Edelson has a great paper in one of the special issues on design research early on about one of the products of design research can be theories of how we go about design. So I wonder if there are different approaches, different design theories that lead one to have different boxes and categories of boxes that one considers. So if you're working in a participatory design framework, is there automatically a box over there about how you're actually organizing the design process that maybe isn't relevant if you're doing that and that's not one of your core commitments in the way you're doing your work? Or does it just change who does the conjecture map if you're doing participatory design?
So that there's I have two things to say about that. One is I think that it's sort of it's one way of articulating a sense of what people might decide is or isn't the value of conjecture mapping, right? So for me, it's like I'm not personally that interested in design theory, so I'm unlikely to ever try to make a conjecture map that accounts for it, right? But if people who are interested in that were to try to do it, and in doing so, they found that there was a useful way to modify boxes or process or whatever, I think that would be very interesting for the field in general to see, right? But it's but you know, I don't presume that people will think conjecture maps are so useful that they're going to use them in all kinds of ways. I just think that's kind of an open thing. Now, there is actually a student here working with Kim Gomez who's actually has been trying to work with teachers to draw conjecture maps about how changes in their instruction might lead to changes in their classrooms, right? Which I think is we don't have a chance to talk about it until next week, so I don't have much to say about it. But the idea of it is actually very interesting to me, because when she first told me she was doing this, I thought, oh God, that's a terrible idea. But I don't know. Maybe it's fun. So it'll be interesting to see like what they make of it.
We're also wondering if you might explore how conjecture maps would work sort of across levels. So, you know, Bill does a lot of DBR work, and you might have one design for how learning is happening in the classroom, and also one conjecture map for all the supports at an implementation level. So I think maybe Bill Penwell might want to talk a little bit about that, but how you could maybe link two different conjecture maps in a bigger project.
Right. And I think there's a seed of that in the 2004 paper, Bill, where you talk about system maps. And yeah, I think it's actually challenging to think about, but some of the work that I do at school districts, I'm thinking about maybe the outcome is teacher capacity building at the level of a school district. But it's never in a vacuum about a vision for how we're also supporting learning. So in work here in Denver, we're doing a lot of work around integrating science and engineering practices into curriculum. So we have some pretty targeted conjectures about what that needs to look like. I would say not everything is in play, meaning we're drawing on a lot of existing work in learning sciences on that. But some of it is in play because there aren't curriculum that are anchored in the next gen science standards, which we're doing, that are like really perfectly reflective of those. But at another level, we have some conjectures that are also partially formed about how curriculum co-design is a strategy for building the capacity of a school district to understand NGSS in next gen science standards. So we haven't drawn out these linked maps. So and one of the things I realize, it's kind of time for us to think about our theory of capacity building, because there's a lot of, and this is a moment to do it because I think we have some ideas. Our partners are in flux, we're in flux, so it's a good time to think, well, where should we go next? And so that's a moment of design conjectures, I think. But I'd love to figure out how these maps link across levels too.
Yeah, so would I. I actually think that's a really interesting idea, and so we're just about to begin some work out here with from my perspective, a pretty large group, like a couple of dozen secondary science teachers around learning to teach NGSS. So we have ideas about how to organize professional development over time, and we have ideas about what that will then do in the classroom, right? So again, you've got two different levels, right? You've got the work with teachers and what teachers are getting out of that, and then that connects to what you think those teachers are then going to do in their classrooms, right? And we have more of a hand in designing the professional development, right? So we're not really designing a lot at the classroom level, right? But we certainly have ideas about if teachers appropriate lessons from the PD in a particular way, then that will lead to particular kinds of things that we will see in their classrooms, right? And but we also haven't yet kind of tried to articulate precisely those of relations, at least not in a map, right? And actually, that's an interesting, like, to me, there's an interesting design issue there, right? Which is sort of, so where is the design, right? From our perspective, the design is really at the professional development level, so that's looking across a group of teachers. But we expect that design then filters down to the individual classroom level, and we expect that because teachers are different, what they're going to learn is different, so we're going to see a lot of variation, right? And so actually part of the research has to be to capture the variation among teachers and link it to variation in the PD, right? So there's a lot of work across levels that hasn't really been sorted out, and it might be I guess, and we were to do what we're doing and actually really try to make maps that linked across level, would then be interesting to kind of compare those efforts and see what it even looks like, or what it even means to do that.
And I'd add here, I think in DBIR, there's, even though I try to talk about designing across levels, there does tend to be a focal level. And I think the discipline, though, that I try to do is to think one level above and one level below. So in any complex system, there are superordinate processes that are in bureaucracies and institutions that shape what goes on, as well as emergent things like norms that emerge from the level that you're working on, but then they influence people. So within a collaborative design team, you'll get norms about how different people interact that then start to shape individual interactions. And then in the case of, if you're working at the PD level, there's always a layer of what's happening in the classroom and how your designs are getting transformed, and then how student responses are shaping what teachers bring back to the professional development, the design work, wherever you are. So part of it is just really making a commitment to seeing across levels, even when your focal design is there, because sometimes you then move up a level, like, oh, we need to actually do, we have to work laterally in school districts, so I got to worry about the accountability people who come and observe in classrooms and what they see. And so that wasn't part of my initial design, but now I'm going to actually design an artifact that helps the teacher deal with that situation and helps the administrators that I'm working with deal with that. So sometimes DBIR is just moving laterally in the same level of the system to a different department and expanding your design work that way.
I had a question about how you use conjecture mapping in your work, but I think you both explained really well. Are there other examples that you would like to share about how you use conjecture mapping in your projects?
I don't have a specific example to show or anything, and I know that Bill Penuel does, and so just being cognizant of the time, maybe Bill, if you wanted to talk through that, we could.
Sure, Jameson, if you'll put that up for me for a second. We have the Wizard of Oz is going to put it up for me, and I'll give the context while I'm talking through. So this is part, I mentioned the project called the Research Practice Collaboratory, and one of our core lines of work is based on a really high-level conjecture around how we actually get existing research out to people, but also how we surface what existing research for practitioners, and practitioners is sort of the wrong term because it's too general, how actually they might find how we might get the right research to them that's relevant to the problems of practice that they're working on. So one of the groups that we work with very closely is the Council of State Science Supervisors. And these are, all 50 states have a state science supervisor, and they have a network, and they have a professional group. And they have recently really organized their efforts around how to support implementation of the framework for K-12 science education, which is the foundational document for the next generation science standards. So we're organized with them, and as I mentioned, I would say this conjecture map emerged in our work as it started to take form. But over here on the far left are some conjectures we're looking at in the collaboratory. So one of the conjectures is, don't go out and try to find an audience. I'm going to put this in different words, but actually find where there are networks of educators who already get together. And so the CS Cubed is a network of educational leaders that already exists. So we think we can engage in something we call productive cultural exchange, where researchers and practitioners are learning from one another through these kinds of engagement. But we also have a conjecture that's pretty grounded in research on research utilization, that just throwing something over the transom to somebody isn't going to lead to meaningful use. We need high-depth interactions to facilitate interpretations of research. Now, part of our struggle is that you can even see how these are framed. This is not, that second conjecture is high level. It's also kind of one way. It's about research to practice. So part of our discipline of as we're moving forward, and we need to revise this one already, is how do we make it a little more two-way? But we have three different, some different ways that we engage folks. And so one of the things I'll mention that's a thread that goes across discursive practices and participant structures and some of the tools and materials is they started having committees on different aspects of science. So one is a professional development committee that I work on. And CS Cubed invited collaboratory researchers to embed themselves in the committees. The committees are run by the CS Cubed. They figure out what it is their charge is. And one of the tools we designed is to help them plan and figure out what their charge was. So we created a charter document in collaboration with them, the leadership and collaboratory researchers, that help organize some of the work. So part of what that runs across is that the participant structure is kind of a working group meeting. So we meet both in person at their meetings, and it's nothing fancy. These are just committee meetings. But what's different about the committee meetings is these would have gone on probably without researchers embedded. And so part of what getting beneath this into specific design conjectures is to think about, well, what's the role of bringing research to bear in that? So I sit on one on professional development. So at a certain point, people pulled up the 1996 standards for professional development that were embedded in NSCS, which is the first generation science standards. And I said, well, there's been a lot of research on professional development since 1996. Maybe we could take a look at it. So I quickly ginned up a little review for our committee just to talk about. And that became one of the sort of initial seeds of a document that we started to develop together that was professional learning standards. So all of this is to say, though, that the conjecture map that's driving this kind of emerged once this committee structure was there, but we started to think about, well, what's the design work going on here? What's making this a different kind of research practice engagement? And some of it is embedding, but it's also thinking about the design process as a way that a collaborative design process is a way we can engage differently. And I'd say a lot of our work in the collaboratories that way is thinking about collaborative design as a really different way of relating research and practice. But also here it matters that CS Cubed leaders, they're driving the show. We're not. We're there to support them. And maybe that's not even embedded here enough in the map. But the map has been useful to try to articulate, not just for us, but also for the National Science Foundation who's funding us. Why are we doing this? What's the special about this design that might lead to a different kind of engagement from what's typical either within professional associations, or if we were to do this work on our own and start develop a bunch of research briefs and see who wanted to see what they look like, see who wanted to use them.
Great, thank you. Since you mentioned National Science Foundation, you know, in research and when we get funding, people ask us about our logic model or our theory of change. So I think it's a good time to maybe talk a little bit about how conjecture mapping is different than a logic model or a theory of change.
So, from my perspective, well, let's see, I can say two things. One is, I'm not sure what a logic model is. Actually, I've never used one. I think for me, a theory of change is a way to communicate to people who aren't the research team what the research team thinks is going to happen, right? So it's a way of communicating to some stakeholders why you think, how you think doing something is going to lead to some change that you think is gonna occur, right? And I'm sure people who are more experienced with them could add to that meager definition. So I think that's fine. For me, what's different is that a conjecture map is actually, for me anyway, the conjecture maps are mostly for me. It's mostly about how to help me think about how I'm going to organize my research. So they don't really encode theory per se, right? They encode a set of relationships that you should go look for in research. So calling back to something Bill said a little while ago about how a lot of the work for him about making a conjecture map is actually sort of annotating it in a sense and sort of specifying what those arrows really mean, right? So an arrow does not make a conjecture, right? The conjecture is actually describing what the arrow actually means, or what a set of arrows kind of working together actually mean. And so, the work of drawing a conjecture map is, I think, the work of laying out for a research team what the specific sort of theoretical conjectures are, and then leading you to think about the kinds of empirical work it would take to find out if those conjectures are viable, right, or not viable. And so I just think that they're different from each other in part because they're oriented to doing different kinds of work. I don't know, Bill. I'd be interested to hear how you think about it.
Yeah, so I came from learning about theory of change through community youth development and participatory evaluation frameworks, and part of why I resonate to conjecture mapping is I see a really strong family resemblance. So, but I think I would underscore it's a certain version of that is, it's about a team getting clear about what its design is and what its assumptions are about connections between how its design is going to lead to mediating processes and outcomes. And as an evaluator, I've facilitated processes where I've been more the researcher who's coming in and there's other people designing. And I've used this process when one of the really powerful tools to do with a team that's implementing something is get them to think about the mediating processes. Because a lot of programs think that design inevitably leads to the outcomes and there's nothing that happens in between. And this discipline of helps me as the evaluator know what to measure. It surfaces for the team that's got a design, some kind of program or intervention, what its commitments are to what its active ingredients are, and also what its bets are about what's going to happen after the design leaves their hands and it's being implemented. So part of it is the letting go, and but also being thoughtful about wait, you know, here are the different things that are likely to happen that need to happen for the, you know, usually because there's somebody in between, a teacher, a youth development specialist who's implementing something who is not the designer. And there are kids interacting with their designs. And this is true for if you're doing an online thing. You know, if you think, oh, I'm just doing this all embedded online. No, what happens in the room and how that's presented, how kids encounter it, a whole bunch of stuff is already out of your control. And those are part of the mediating processes that it's just super valuable for to map. So, like for me, it's just a difference in the who, but I think the function we're in agreement about is that it's really a tool for the designer to be accountable for their design, to be explicit, to kind of figure out what they think is going on and should be going on.
Yeah, so let me just add one more thing to that, Sinem, because I think that's a really great answer. And so again, just to call back to something that we talked about earlier, for me, I think actually maybe the most important piece of a conjecture map is that piece around sort of theorizing what you think the mediating processes are that are at work, and it is actually, I think, very closely linked to this causal process view about causality, right? It's about making very specific commitments to what you think the causal processes are that are at work.
Would you like to add something, Bill, or should I follow
I was going to ask a question that might take us in a different direction, but if there are questions from the Etherpad, ask those first.
I think you can go ahead and ask your question.
So, Bill, I want to know, do you see a role for counter-conjectures in your conjecture map? Because I have found them pretty valuable as part of the, like going back to Bob Yin's work around case studies. He really talks about the need for rival conjectures in case studies. And by that same logic, I sort of think, wow, it's kind of nice. It's a nice discipline to think about counter-conjectures.
So I guess do I see a role for thinking about counter-conjectures or for
putting them in the map, reifying them so that, again, you're accountable now in developing evidence related to the counter-conjectures as well as the conjectures?
I mean, so again, you're asking this really good question that I've never thought about before. I mean, I guess I think two things. One is, I personally think that the effort to create the conjectures you have in some ways entails thinking about counter-conjectures, right? And I think, so this is one of those things where what I'd like to see is, I'd like to see someone do that, right? So someone take a stab at reifying counter-conjectures and then figuring out whether that does good work for you or not, right? So to me, I think that would be the proof of the value of the idea would be if someone tried it and then said, oh, this is how it helped us. I'm not opposed to it.
We'll give it a try in the collaboratory. We're doing it. We're doing a bit of that. So.
Great. So I would love to see it, actually. I think that would be really helpful.
So I think we can wrap up by saying that both bills have given us a lot of homework in terms of what the next steps are and things that can happen with conjecture maps across space and time and counter-conjectures. So everyone listening should just start writing those papers for us. And we want to thank you both so much for participating and being here with us today.
Thanks. It was a pleasure. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks. I had a really good time. Thanks to Bill and to Eve Mans and Daniela and Sinem and Katie for inviting me. It's really helpful. Thanks.
I appreciate it.